All right, grab a Bible if you will, and let's turn to John chapter 3. We're going to study from a story about John the Baptist. Here we go, John chapter 3. Hey, good to hear all that. Good to hear you encouraging one another in the Lord. We got to do that as a church family. And if we don't encourage each other, sometimes nobody will. So I'm glad we're all of like-minded faith and keeping as strong and as healthy as we can faithfully as we do the same thing physically, for sure. John chapter 3 is our passage today, and we're going to talk a little bit about John the Baptist again. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we brought John the Baptist up as the man who was the voice crying in the wilderness, and he ends up baptizing Jesus. And you think that he's gone from the picture because Jesus starts his ministry. But John, the writer, says, wait, we got to learn a couple more lessons from John the Baptist. So this is John chapter 3, about verses 22 and following. In this situation, John has got a decision to make. He's got to make a decision of how important he is versus how important Christ is in his life. And John had the opportunity to be pretty arrogant about this because in the Old Testament, there were stories that said the one is coming who will introduce Christ. A couple of the prophets of old said, yeah, this guy is coming. So in those days, the people were used to hearing guys like Abraham and Moses and all these important guys of God. And then we get 400 years of silence, and then John breaks on the scene. And John's like, hey, I'm that guy. I'm the voice crying in the wilderness. I'm the most important person on the planet right now. He had the chance to be a little bit arrogant, but we're going to see how he responds to that. Recently, I read a story about a pilot. Now, sometimes pilots are pretty confident in themselves, and I'm glad that they're confident in what they do. But, you know, sometimes they go a little overboard. You might say that they're a little arrogant from what they do, and that's okay at times, but times not. Well, one plane ride turned out a little different than the pilot hoped. It was a very rough flight. The air pockets were just throwing the plane all over the place. And then the landing was just horrible, and it was just wild. And the crew and all the passengers really were afraid. And finally they touched down. Well, the company that the pilot worked for, they had the tradition that you, the pilot, have got to stand by the exit door and greet everybody as they leave. You know, you've probably flown and seen that. And so as he stood there, what he noticed was nobody said a word to him about the flight or the landing as they all filed off the plane. Not many of them even looked eye to eye with him until the last lady on the plane, an aged lady with a cane, walked by and said, "Pilot, can I ask you something?" He said, "Yeah, sure." "Yeah, okay. Did we just land or were we shot out of the sky?" Sometimes just a little humbling does us some good, doesn't it? John chapter 3, verse 22. John has got to say clearly how important Jesus Christ is in his life and in the life of those that would be changed forever because of Christ. Here we go. John chapter 3, 22. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was plentiful there. And people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew, that was, over purification. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, whom you bore witness, look, he's baptizing, and all are going to him. And John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. And then verse 30, he must increase and I must decrease. Here's what's going on. You don't have dueling banjos in this story. You have dueling baptisms in this story. And John's got a following, a bunch of disciples, and then Jesus has a following, a bunch of disciples, and John's disciples are noticing that Jesus is getting more and more disciples here, and they're not really talking about purification, the conflict that arose. They're talking about who's following who. And John puts it into record to say, wait a minute, it's all about Jesus Christ. When I come to this passage, I flash back to a class that I had when I was at university. It was the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John class was a pretty deep class. But what the professor said, he said, I want all of you students to pick one verse out of this whole book, and that verse needs to become your favorite verse. He was just trying to get us to memorize something, I guess. And some chose John 3:16, which we all know about, and some chose others. I chose John 3:30. It says, he must increase and I must decrease. That became my favorite verse. I went with a friend to her banquet, and she cross-stitched a little thing for me. It was in a frame, and I still have it in my office or my office at home. It says, he must increase and I must decrease. And so this passage to me was very appropriate at the time. I had noticed in myself that I had thought of myself much higher than I should have. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. I was a big man on campus. At least I thought I was. When I was in the room by myself, I was sure I was. What did my father say one time? He said, even if you have as many degrees as a thermometer, you still aren't the most important person in the room. And I needed to be humbled. And that verse spoke to me, and still does today, to say there's somebody in this room, actually a whole lot of people, but especially Jesus Christ, who in my life needs to be seen as the most important person in my life. And that's Jesus Christ. And John's whole purpose was to point people to Jesus Christ. And maybe my whole purpose needs to be that. And maybe your Christian life needs to be like that too. And perhaps your calling in life is simply to point people to Jesus Christ. Not that you'll need to stand on a street corner and preach or do some kind of, public presentation, but somehow in each of your young lives, older lives, you just are called to point your grandkids, your great-grandkids, to Jesus Christ. John wanted to set the record straight. And so here's what he first did. Now, John, the writer, and John, the baptizer, they agreed and they wrote things down of the things that John the Baptist said and that John said that he said. And so here's how John first introduces himself. John says about himself, or John says about John the Baptist, he is not the light. He is not the Christ. He is not the prophet Elijah or Isaiah. He is just a voice crying in the wilderness. He is not worthy to unstrap Jesus' sandals. We are putting things together when John is presenting this whole story to say, I know my place, and my place is not the place of prestige. I'm just somebody here to show others to Jesus. And it's not as if we all understood that, so John writes it again in John chapter 3, verse 28. I am not the light. Verse 29, the next four of these. Christ is the bridegroom. I am the bridegroom's friend. I rejoice when hearing his voice. He makes my joy complete. John is saying, I know that Christ is most important in my life. Now, you may expect me to put myself on a pedestal. Not going to do it. I want to be talking about Christ more than I talk about myself. And this is why this verse meant so much to me back in college and still does. I found myself often telling stories about myself. I had a very unique childhood. I grew up in Africa. I grew up on the island of Jamaica and did surfboard evangelism. I just traveled the world when I was a kid. I've been inside the pyramids. I've ridden camels in Egypt. I mean, you name it. I was very quick to tell the stories about myself to make myself look better or feel better or to help others see how important I was. And this scripture slapped me in the face. He must increase and I must decrease. And let those words sink into you. Because if your life to others seems to them like you might present yourself as the most important person in your life, there may be a challenge that you need to conquer. There may be a way you need to look at yourself a little differently for a number of reasons. Somebody said this about humility. It's not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Did you get that? Here's the challenge that I had. For a while I said, okay, I'm going to put myself in the right place in this picture with Christ in the picture. I am a low life. I am worm dirt. I am useless. I am pointless. I don't have any talent. I don't have any ability. And I really talked myself down to put others up, but especially to put Christ up. But then I began to realize that I am made in the image of God himself. God does not want us to feel that poorly of ourselves. He wants us to realize who we are. We are sons and daughters of his. But even in that picture, we must still elevate Christ more than ourselves. And that's the big challenge in our lives these days. Verse 29, John introduces Jesus Christ a little differently than what we have seen him before. When Jesus becomes greater in my world, I become less in my world, and my joy increases because we see him in a different light. And here's the reason John says his joy is made complete. It's because he has decided to put Jesus up in his life and himself, not that high. Now, let me just talk about us for just a second here, okay? Over the course of the last year, you may have realized this yourselves. Those people who have put Christ in his proper position in their life, they are the ones who have had less stress and less turmoil and less worry concerning the pandemic, politics, you name it. When you realize how important Christ is in your life, your worry goes away because you're not in charge. God's in charge. Christ can handle any challenge we have. Cast your cares on him. And so those who have decided that their thoughts and their ideas and their passion for things of one persuasion or of another are most important, and so they post it everywhere they can, they're the ones that are the most stressed because they perhaps think that their voice is more important than the voice of Christ himself. There's the challenge for us, and it has been over the last year. Are we going to say, God has got this? Because of Jesus Christ, I am not worthy? One preacher said that I watched a little bit of an interview. He was up for some great position, and he was really lambasted by others who thought he would not get that position. And he said, here's the deal. If I win, I win. If I lose, I win. Because I'm just doing what God wants me to do, even in that loss. If things go my way in the pandemic, I win. If things don't, I win. Because I have Christ in the right position in my life. Because I have God in the right authority of my life. If I win, I win. And if I lose, I still win. That's the idea of those who know that Christ is foremost in their life, most important. John also said he's the one that we listen to. We don't listen to John anymore. We don't listen to what our favorite television station is or our favorite preacher even. I know it's not me. That's okay. But we listen to Jesus Christ over everybody else. Can I get, oh yeah? And that's why we have comfort. That's why we have joy. That's why we have peace. I'm going with what he says. And that's what John is absolutely saying. And then he introduces him as the bridegroom. The bridegroom. Back in their day, if they had a wedding, which they did, they had many. In fact, the first time we see Jesus Christ, he's at a wedding, right? This is in John chapter 2. It is as if John said, let me introduce this wedding of Cana and how important Jesus was at the wedding at Canaan. And then let me tell you what, he's really just not going to a wedding. He's the bridegroom. So who's the most important person at a wedding? Have you ever thought about that? I think it's got to be the preacher, right? The preacher, because he does the take him, take her, took things. He decides that they can't get married without a preacher. He's the most important person at the wedding. Well, that's not right. So some of you might agree it is the mother of the bride, right? The mother of the bride is the most important because everything has to go exactly how she planned it all those years. Well, sorry to break it to you, you're not the most important person at the wedding. How about the father of the bride? Listen, I was one of those too for a couple of times. The father of the bride. He writes the checks, right? That's the most important person at the wedding. That's it. No, that's not it. When my two daughters were preparing for their weddings, their weddings were so important that a television show was developed to aid them and assist them in the wedding. It was called Say Yes to the Dress. Have you seen that show? It was about eight years ago. It was so popular. It was on that television program so that my daughters could watch it and see what they didn't have. The brides would go into the stores and have 1 million dresses to choose from at $1 million a piece, it seemed. And they just did, sometimes they got 2 or 3 dresses and they just got to choose. And so my daughters would just belly up to that television and say, okay, I want that one and that one and that one. That television show cost me money, a lot of it. Actually, they were so good to me. My daughters, that is. John would say, in those days, the groom was the most important person at the wedding. Now, these days we have a little more understanding about how our culture does this. But in those days, it was the groom who said, will you spend your life with me? It was by his initiative. And then if she said yes, then he did everything. And he promised to love her the rest of their lives, and to provide for her the rest of her life, to take care of her socially and emotionally and physically and in every way. It was the husband, the bridegroom, saying, I'm taking this person on and I will take care of her for life. And they'll go to the altar and he'll say, I love you, you love me, let's spend life together. And he makes the commitment. And so John says, I'm just a groomsman. Let me tell you about the groom. He is the one assuming the responsibility. But he's also assuming that they're going to have great joy. Remember that passage we looked at a little earlier, that your joy may be complete? Nobody goes to a wedding and they say, I hate you, you hate me, let's get married. That's not what they say. They say, listen, we are going to have a joyous marriage and a joyous wedding, and it's all about joy, bringing joy together, and moms and dads and families are all thrilled for this day and the joy that it brings, because the bridegroom is here and he's chosen a spouse, and it's putting together this family for the cause of Christ, really. And there's such great joy here. Everybody celebrates because of the joy that's possible. And it's the wedding scene he brings us back to again. You see, he's the bridegroom who has a bride that comes to him ready for this joy to begin. I think it's interesting that John, the writer John, introduces this idea, and then in the book of Revelation, it also brings it out. John 2, he says the wedding in Cana. And then he says in John 3, Jesus is the bridegroom. And they say to each other, I love you and you love me. Let's spend our lives together enjoying this thing called love. And then he says, okay, I've introduced it in John chapter 2 and John chapter 3. I'm going to introduce it again in Revelation 22:17. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And then he goes on to say, I love you and you love me. Let's spend our lives in eternity together. He's reflecting on Christ as the bridegroom again. He wants to spend eternity with everybody. Just come, just come. And this is chapter 19, verse 7 of Revelation. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come and his wife has made herself ready. Come, come, just come. And the most thrilling day in the lives of most couples is their wedding day. But the saddest day also happens if the bride or the groom doesn't show up. Can you imagine? I know someone personally who was standing at the altar. He was standing at the altar, and the chosen bride did not show up. And he waited, and the only thing that he could think about was, I hope she comes. I hope she comes through those doors at the back. I'm going to look in the parking lot. I hope she's going to show up. Maybe she was just late. I hope she comes walking down the aisle. And I hope she comes and stands next to me. And I hope that she'll make the vow to me that I have already made for her. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited, and she didn't show. And the last time I saw him, he was nearly 80 years old, and he had never married because his heart was so broken when he was 23. I think John had a deeper meaning when he talked to that culture about the bridegroom waiting and saying, come. And I think he wants people to see how Christ is just waiting. Come, just come. Please come. Show up at the wedding. Come be connected with Christ. Come promising your love as he has already promised you his. Come. Choose to spend eternity with Christ, enjoying that thing called love. Just come. And that's why Christ stands at the door and he knocks. Just open the door. Come on, make that decision and spend a lifetime here in the grip of the grace of Jesus Christ, and then spend eternity as the bride will with her groom. Come. Church, that's what Christ can mean to you if you just simply elevate him. And the more you elevate him in your life, the more joy you will have, the more peace you will have when you say, I put my life in his hands. You'll experience joy like you've never before. God bless you today as we see ourselves as the bride of Christ. And he calls you today to come, to come. Let's stand and sing together.